I'm going to use my time here to focus more specifically on the US-Iran relationship and the policies that have been pursued over the last 15 months, and hopefully perhaps in the Q&A also get into a little bit more about the internal situation in Iran, which unfortunately looks very, very dire. The Obama administration, in my assessment, opened up when it came to US-Iran relations with a tremendous amount of creativity and force, and should really be commended for its ability. When the Obama administration began changing the language of the United States when it dealt with Iran, changing the tone, and creating an opening, creating an atmosphere that would make it possible for some form of diplomacy to be pursued. I think the Nowruz message, the New Year message that the President gave last year was absolutely brilliant, and it really put the Iranian government in a position in which it was very unused to dealing with a constructive and strategically oriented America that wanted to resolve conflict. It had grown accustomed and actually quite astute at dealing with an America led by the behavior of the Iranian government, particularly what happened in the last elections, the tremendous voter fraud, and then the subsequent massive human rights abuses. The President lost significant time, and he also made a task of engaging with an Iran that was openly engaging in such activities much more difficult. Nevertheless, by October last year, an opening for diplomacy was found. And what started off initially as somewhat optimistic and some significant progress seemed to be in the making. By end of October, unfortunately, due to several factors, of which the most important one was political disarray in Iran and the political chaos that existed there that disabled the Iranians from actually being able to make big decisions. If more time had been given, and this is one of the flaws on the US side in my view, if more time had been given, and if the modalities of diplomacy had been somewhat different, then perhaps something could have been achieved in October. But bottom line is that it wasn't. And it was primarily because the Iranians couldn't come to a decision due to the very intense infighting that they were engaged in. The administration continued for another 2 months without necessarily doing much, hoping that something would change in Iran and that the Iranians would come to some form of decision. But by end of December, it was clear this was not going to happen, and that's when the administration entered into what has been called the pressure phase. The administration presents this, and this would be my constructive criticism of the current approach, as a dual-track policy. But unfortunately, at least what has openly been visible, much of the focus is actually on the pressure track. There's very little that has been done on the diplomacy track beyond the diplomacy that is needed to get sanctions. And I think this was most visible with the decision by the administration to very quickly and rather undiplomatically reject the opening that had been created by the Brazilians and the Turks in finding a way to revive the TRR, the Tehran Research Reactor deal that the United States was trying to get back in October. Now, I think some of the criticisms of the administration of the specifics of the deal that Turkey and Brazil managed to get are quite legitimate. It is true that today, shipping 1,200 kilos of low-enriched uranium out of Iran is no longer 75% of their stockpile. It's around 50% of their stockpile, meaning that the Iranians have continued to build their stockpile, so that the gain is not as great as it would have been in October. It is also true, and perhaps more importantly, that in October, the Iranians were not enriching to 20% enrichment. Today they are. It's only a very small cascade of 164 centrifuges, not a big operation, but they are engaging in that. Neither one of these two points were directly addressed by the Brazilians and the Turks in the deal. But at the same time, in their defense, we know now that there was a letter from President Obama to President Lula as well as to Erdogan on April 20th, only 2.5, 3 weeks before the negotiations between Iran, Turkey, and Brazil reached their climax, in which there is no mention of the 20%, nor any particular mention that 1,200 kilos would only be 50% of their stockpile and as a result not valuable. On the contrary, there is strong encouragement for the Turks and the Brazilians to go and pursue this path. I think bottom line is this though. This deal may not have been a perfect deal, but it was an opening, an opportunity to build on it and see what better could have been achieved. Opportunities between the United States and Iran for diplomacy have been very, very few in the last 30 years. So whenever an opportunity emerges, even if it's imperfect, experience would teach us that it's probably better to try to utilize it and see what can be built on it, rather than to very quickly, abruptly, and undiplomatically reject it and make two very strong US allies, Turkey and Brazil, look like fools and naive for having pursued this path to begin with. Now, what was the choice then? The choice at the end of the day, and I want to emphasize this is my constructive criticism of what the administration has been doing. The choice at the end of the day became choosing between the Brazilian deal and at a minimum get 1,200 kilos of LEU out of Iran, which is nevertheless one bomb's worth of LEU, or get these sanctions that eventually were passed in the Security Council. Now, I feel somewhat bad having to say this, but these sanctions at the end of the day were the smallest increase of sanctions in the Security Council since the first Security Council resolution against Iran. This was the fourth one. So even though the administration is correct in saying that these are the strongest sanctions, it is also correct to say that it's the smallest increase of tightening of these sanctions. And it is a sanctions resolution that at the end of the day met stiff resistance. You had two major countries voting against it. That has never happened before in any of the three resolutions prior to this, including another country that also voted abstention. It's also noteworthy that for the first time, not only was there two negative votes, but one of the negative votes came from a non-Muslim country. So at the end of the day, the record of the administration on this is to get a weaker sanction than any of the Bush administration sanctions. And to get it after a year and a half of diplomacy with 3 votes against the resolution, whereas the Bush administration with almost no diplomacy worthy of the name got 2 unanimous ones and 1 with 1 abstention. I think it was an erroneous choice. And I fear that it may be an indication that right now, mindful of the fact that this task turned out to be much more difficult than the administration expected. And it turned out that completely unforeseen things happened, such as the voter fraud and human rights abuses in Iran that really threw everything off. That we may have lacked some of the determination and some of the political space to be able to go through with this. We shouldn't have been that naive in some sense, because just as every other Middle East conflict has not been easy and has not been able to be resolved after 12 weeks of diplomacy, the Iranian question is also going to be very, very difficult to address successfully. And it's going to take a significant amount of time. But political space, and I know I'm reiterating what others have been saying, is absolutely critical here. There was a calculation in the administration that by getting these sanctions, some political space would be created in order to be able to restart diplomacy. I personally don't believe that that's going to be the case, because in the balance between creating political space at home for diplomacy and creating an atmosphere conducive to diplomacy internationally, the balance of passing these actions is in the negative. We may have created political space for diplomacy that unfortunately won't ever take place right now, due to the souring of the international atmosphere of imposing the sanctions in the first place. I think it's critical as a result to use every opportunity to be able to create political space for the administration, because I am still personally convinced that even though I fear that the administration is inadvertently walking back into a Bush paradigm of policy in which the pillars of our Iran policy is increasingly on pressure and eventually regime change, I don't believe that this is something that is done deliberately. I think this is done because other ideas in this short period of time have not worked, and we're falling into bad habits. And unfortunately, we have 30 years of bad habits when it comes to dealing with Iran, and the Iranians have 30 years of bad habits when it comes to the United States. Those bad habits, at the end of the day, can only be changed through the work of organizations such as yours, creating the political space so that when we pursue a gigantic diplomatic endeavor like this, we will have enough strength, space, and determination to overcome the first hurdle on the road, as well as the last hurdle on the road. And this specific effort that we did, that the administration did in this past year and a half, unfortunately, it failed at the first hurdle. Thank you so much.